For woodworkers, the table saw is the heart of the shop, but it's also the one that causes the most injuries. Over 60,000 life-changing injuries a year on the table saw. But getting your finger sliced off isn't the only danger here. So today I'm going to warn you about 13 common mistakes that people make, how to avoid them so you can safely and accurately use your table saw. The most obvious risk with a table saw is lacerations and amputations, right? But one of the most dangerous things that can happen is kickback. In fact, a kickback happens so fast that you won't even see it coming. In fact, it looks like this. And here's that same clip in slow motion. Poor Danny DeVito. Kickback is when a board or piece of wood gets pinched in between the saw blade and the rip fence, or it can pinch the blade, it can get caught in your crosscut sled, in the kerf left over from your blade. There's a lot of ways it can happen. Let's come in here and let me show you some of the ways it can happen and how you can avoid it. Now, proper safety and safety tools are incredibly important. We're going to get more into those here in a second. But the easiest way to avoid kickback is making sure your equipment is set up correctly. And what does that mean? That means your saw blade is parallel to your miter slot and your fence is parallel to your blade and also your miter slot. So let me show you how to check that. It's very easy, but if you want to see more in depth on how to set up a table saw, I have a great Tune-Up Tuesday video that I'll link down below. Now, when you're setting up your blade to ensure that it's parallel to your miter slot, you can do it with a combo square, or you can get something real scientific like this. And it's very easy to do. What you need to do is pick a singular tooth that is facing towards your miter slot. Now, I like to take some marker and just draw on it so I know which tooth I'm using. So what you want to do is take your square and have something flat and straight in your miter slot, and then you just want that tooth to be able to scrape the end of that square. Do you hear that? Then you're going to take that same tooth that you've put marker on, go to the back of your saw, and same thing. Here, it's just barely tapping that, just barely scraping by. Then you know that you're exactly parallel on both sides. And it's really important to use the same tooth in case there's any wobble in your arbor or anything like that, so you know that you're measuring for the same place. Now, there's an argument to be made that your blade can come out just like a thou this way away from your fence, because usually you're cutting on the right side of your blade in between with the fence, with the rip fence. And so if you're canted out just a tiny, 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 tiny bit, then there's much less chance of it pinching. But parallel is great, and now we know that we're parallel to our miter slot, and now it's time to check our fence. Now for us, we're gonna use the next tooth because this is an alternate tooth bevel combo blade, and so we wanna make sure that we have the tooth that's facing this way now. You know, there's lots of other tools to do this. This is a great thing from MagSwitch, which it rides on a miter gauge, and you can check it the same way. You can do this lots of different ways, but this is definitely one of the easiest. And this one, what I like to do is take my blade so that it's spanning the full 12 inches and just scraping by like it was before. Hear that? And I'm gonna take that same thing, move it over here, ensuring I'm keeping pressure against the side, because even if you have something that's really tight in your miter slot, it might have a little bit of play. So make sure that you're putting pressure the other way. I'm gonna take that same tooth. You can hear it's just barely scraping by, just like that. And I know that my fence is perfectly parallel to the blade. Now, if you need to adjust it, every fence is going to be different, but there'll be 2 screws in here that help change it like this. You just want to make sure that you're parallel. The next one is reaching over your table saw blade. Now, recently there was a video going around, I think it was top on Reddit, of a woman who was cutting a circle using a sled on a table saw, and she was making passes and then pulling the sled back, and she reached over to pull the sled back towards her, and when she did, the circle caught on the blade and pulled her hand into the blade. I'm going to show it right here. Terrifying, right? Now, this could have been avoided, and thankfully she had a saw stop. So there's a couple ways to avoid this. One is turn your saw off, and if you don't want to do that, it's use a push stick. Let me show you my technique. Push sticks are amazing. These ones are great, but you want to make sure you're not pushing too much downward pressure. I've seen people break these. I typically like this style. In fact, we sell a free set of PDFs that I'll link over that you can just trace this out and cut it yourself. But I'm going to show you how I kick them out, and you just want to make sure that you're not reaching over your blade. Next one seems pretty intuitive, but I've seen a lot of people do it, and it is never cut freehand. Sometimes you get boards like a live edge slab where you have no straight edge, and for a cut to be safe on table saw, it needs to pass through in a straight line, because the blade is not only cutting at the front, but then also at the back. And so if you twist a little bit, that's when things pick up. You saw from that slow motion video that it picked it up in the back of the blade, and that's when you're gonna get kickback. Same thing with the woman who was cutting the circle. It was the back of the blade that caught the piece. So you wanna cut using a fence or a straight line rip jig. A board like this, you can't have a straight line to cut it, and you would never put that against your fence for the same reason that it can twist. So you want to use a straight line rip jig here. We actually have plans for a great sled called the Katz-Moses multi-sled over on my website. Those are also free, and it's real cool. So make yourself something like that if you need to straight line rip something. It also works for jointing the edge of a board. It's very similar to my next tip, which is never remove your riving knife. This is your riving knife. It moves up and down with your blade, and it is the most critical protector from kickback. The reason it is so critical, in fact, when we shot that slow motion video about kickback, we had to take this out because we could not cause kickbacks with this installed. What it does is it keeps your blade from turning into the back of the blade being picked up and flung towards you. So it is aligned with the teeth on this side, but slightly inside of them. I'm talking minor, a hair's width inside of them. It is actually much more in from the left side because it's designed to be able to also accept thin curved blades, so it's thinner than your 1/8 inch blade. So it should be aligned with your right, or I guess whatever side you're cutting with your rip fence on, which is 99% of the time on the right hand side of the blade. The other feature of it is it keeps your board from pinching the back of the blade. A lot of times when you're doing long rip cuts, you'll relieve some stress in the board you didn't know was there, and it'll want to twist towards the blade. Now, you can fix that by stopping your cut, turning your saw off, backing out and recutting it, and that should relieve the stress where you want it to. The only time you would ever make a cut without your riving knife in is when you're using a dado stack. I have a great video on dado stacks, and from our No BS series we just released, we talk more about this, but riving knife is taller than a dado stack, and dado stacks are never used for through cuts. So you would never use a dado stack and a riving knife, and that's the only time you cut without it. Your other option is your saw most definitely came with a big plastic guard that has 2 kickback pawls on it, as well as a riving knife. They look like these half moons with giant teeth on them, and they are very good at stopping kickback and protecting your hands. It's a shame that most woodworkers remove them. I'm guilty of it myself. That would be the ultimate protector, is using that. Let's say you did everything right though. You set up your saw, you have your riving knife in there, you do the cuts, and you still get a kickback. Where should you be standing? When we did our kickback video, we did about 15 kickbacks in a controlled environment. You saw in that clip, we had this big thing we built, this jig for causing the kickback, and 99% of the time it went one direction, and it is like this right here. It was very hard for us to hit Danny DeVito. We had to get him in the perfect spot, and it was very clear that kickbacks come straight back in between your blade and your fence. And so where should you stand? I like to stand here, and for a few reasons. I guess you could technically stand on this side of your fence, but I don't like that because that's gonna cause forces that push into your blade. So as you're making a cut, you want to be pushing something, maybe we'll talk about it a little bit, but like a featherboard or another push stick pushing into your blade, you should be standing away. And I don't know anybody's ever cut like a thin strip with your fence, you know, right here, and it almost always kicks back, but it's gonna go right in between your fence and your hip. So you wanna be standing off to the side. You don't wanna have your face over the blade like this. You wanna be standing here. And then, God forbid you get a kickback, may hit you in the shoulder, some meaty spot of your body, or it's gonna pass between your arm and your hip, and you should be good to go. So make sure you're standing off to the side and never, never standing directly behind your blade. Now, we've beat kickbacks to death here, pun intended, and let's talk about lacerations. Table saw lacerations happen, and a lot of times it happens during a kickback because your hand is yanked somewhere you don't want it to be. So let's talk about tooth height. Now, what do you think is gonna have more of a chance of cutting your hand? If your blade is up like this when you're cutting, or, ooh, we need to grease that baby, when your blade is just barely out of the board. Now, let me show you here. If something were to happen, if you were to slip, if your push tip was to break, which has happened to people before, you're gonna get a cut that is minor compared to what would happen if your saw blade was way up. Because if you fall into this blade and your saw blade is this high, your hand is gone, your fingers are gone. But here, we're gonna get a cut. We're gonna get some stitches. Not gonna be happy about it, but we'll live to fight another day. So, you wanna make sure that your blade is less than an 1/8 inch out of your board. And what I do, every time I walk up to cut, you start to build these routines. Everything I do, I come up to the blade, and before I ever turn it on, I just take my material that I'm gonna be cutting, just get it right above the blade, and then we're gonna make a cut. So it's important to keep your blade low and adjust it every time. Never be lazy, never be lazy. The next one we're gonna talk about is gonna be a two-parter, and it is you should never cut boards that are wider than they are long without the support of a crosscut sled or a miter gauge. And the reason for that is, and I've seen people do this, I think this may be one of the biggest beginner mistakes, is people think, especially when you get a board that is a little bit bigger, people think, oh, I can just put it this way and use 2 push paddles and I'll be real careful. and I'll keep my board pressed real nicely against the fence. But as you saw from those videos where a kickback happened, it happens too fast and it is so much stronger and there's so many forces than you can control. It's just not stable. And not only that, but when you get through your cut and you get, let's say you get through it without incident, when you get here, you are in a super pinch situation. Any sort of movement like that, and it's just gonna kick back very fast. Now let me show you another one with a miter gauge or a crosscut sled. This is a Falcon 9 rocket. No, just kidding. This is the world's fanciest miter gauge. And in fact, we're gonna be carrying these in our store, should be in a couple weeks. One of the biggest mistakes I see people make is they use the fence as a stop block. Now you've supported your board on this side, which is great, that's good. But what's gonna happen is as soon as this finishes cutting, you're in a pinch situation. You're gonna have a board that is loose between your fence and your board, which is a no-no. You never wanna do that without a push stick. Now, adding a push stick to this situation doesn't make it any better because the board is still wider than it is long. So we need to create a stop block. So what you wanna do is create a stop block that is before your blade. These are really cool. These are called fence clamps. We sell them over at kmtools.com. Drill a 3/8" hole in something and you can attach to your fence. Otherwise, you can double stick tape something. You can clamp something way back here. But the point is you create a stop and then you go forward. And so once you're past your stop block, you then have tons of space over here and nothing is gonna get pinched in between your blade and your offcut, and you're so much safer. So make sure when you're dealing with boards that are wider than they are long, number one rule, don't do it without support, and also never try and use your fence as your final measurement. Make sure you put a stop block in there. These are push sticks. I got a lot of them. This isn't even half of my push stick collection, but there's an important thing to know about push sticks, and it's how to use them correctly. Just because you have a push stick doesn't mean it's gonna prevent you from getting hurt. Now let's talk about the different types of push sticks and why that's important. And when I say like the quality of your push stick matters, this is those cheap ones you can get off Amazon. These are garbage. We have a set we sell on our website, these red molded plastic. They are so much thicker. I mean, look at how much better these are. But I digress. So there's this type of push stick I really like. This is the one we have free PDF so you can make it yourself. And the most important part about a push stick is that it pushes down on your board and has a heel that can push your board forward. Now the great thing about wooden push sticks is you can cut into them. See all of these, they've been cut into. The other thing that's really important is you have something like this little bird's beak here that can push your board down and into your fence as well. These are great, but I've seen people break these. So when I use these, I only use it to push forward, and I have something else that pushes down on the board. So let me show you how I actually use these. Forgot to mention these two. These are great. I use these mostly on the jointer or for very big pieces. They're great because of the angle of the handle. It means you're always pushing into your fence. So when you have big wide open space between the blade and your rip fence, it's great because you're pushing down and you're pushing towards your fence. Now, when I'm cutting a board, I always keep my push sticks right to the right of my fence, lined up like this, with the handles in the air, so that way when I grab them, they're in the correct position. Now, that's for a much bigger board that I'm not gonna start using towards the end of my cut, but when I'm cutting a smaller board, especially if I don't have a feather board, I'm always gonna have two push sticks in my hand. I'm gonna have one that's pushing towards my fence. Now you can hold it like a feather board where you're pushing into your fence like this. And then another one that is pushing down on the board and using the heel to push it through the cut. I'm gonna demonstrate that once with the saw on. Now, if you practice these things, that just becomes second nature. When I approach my table saw, I always do the same things. I check my blade height, I set up my push sticks, and then I ensure that I have the right setup, and I go ahead and turn the saw on, I push through the cut, and then I kick my offcut back with the heel on my board. And again, having a push stick that you can cut into is great because when you're doing thinner cuts, and anybody who's done this knows it can cause kickback, it's gonna allow you to just push through the board. You can cut your push stick, you don't care, because you can always replace the heel on it, who cares, right? You also saw me do one more thing, which leads me into my next tip, which is, as I was pushing through, I kept this push stick over here, because you never wanna push into your board, and here's why. So if I was to continue to push, let's say this was the end of my board, and continue to push from the outside here, I'm pushing my board into the blade, which is gonna cause it to pinch and grab and push. So you wanna make sure that whether it's your push stick or your feather board, it is behind the front of your blade. You're never gonna push here. You're gonna wanna make sure you always stop right here behind the front of your blade, and that way you're never pushing any pressure. You don't care about the offcut. It's gonna come off safely over here, and that's why we kick it out at the end. But again, never wanna put pressure anywhere past the front of the blade. Now, we talked about why a board needs to be straight and pass through the cut straight and why it needs to be supported by a rip fence, but the other thing you want to worry about is a wonky board. You don't want to pass twisted or severely cupped boards because they have the ability to rotate into the blade and not exit the same way that they entered the cut on the table saw. Now, I know in the beginning, especially when you're getting started in woodworking, that's not always easy because you don't have the right tools like a jointer. Some of you may not have a planer yet. So I have a great video on 6 ways to joint a board without a jointer. I also have a no BS series on it and how to get a board flat and square so you can cut it safely. So make sure you're not passing any warped, twisted, or cupped boards through your blade without securing it safely. The next mistake I see is people cutting without outfeed and sometimes infeed support. Now, nothing causes you to reach over the table saw more than a giant board that you're trying to support and make sure it doesn't fall on the ground, and you're wrestling with it, and that's just a big mistake. And outfeed support, and also infeed support if you need it, if you're trying to cut a giant piece of plywood, is real cheap. You get to, like this, a roller, or I'm sure every one of you has made a sawhorse. So create a couple sawhorses, make sure to protect yourself. I built some really cool, like super bougie sawhorses beginning of last year that have like a roller system on top that works really, really great, but make sure you're supporting the board on the outfeed and if you need to, the infeed side of your cut. All right, now, well, let's say you wanted to cut really thin strips. Now your instinct may be to bring your rip fence almost to your blade and then make those cuts, but that's almost a guaranteed kickback. Every time I do that, it shoots in between your hip and your arm, and that's not good. So there's a couple ways to cut really thin strips that really work. First one is a thin rip jig. Now this is one we carry over at KM Tools. This thing's a beast, and you would just take it and you set it, you know, whatever, an 1/8 inch from your blade. You want to set it in front of your blade, lock it down like that. It's very solid. Then you just take your rip fence, move it over again, and you can make that same cut. And this bearing makes it really easy. The rigidity makes it just stick right in place. So it's like essentially a stop block for the left side of your saw. So then you get these perfectly thin strips. We actually sell a kit where you can make your own. They look just like this on the side of this featherboard, which is just something that locks into your miter slot. Speaking of featherboards, let's talk about how to use one of these correctly. These are 3 different types of featherboards that we sell, and their purpose is not only to push your board into the fence, but should there be a kickback, your board's gonna get hung up on these and not kick back towards you. So you saw me with the 2 push sticks where I was pushing into the fence and using a push stick. Now, featherboards actually get rid of the need for a second push stick. So let me show you how we set these up. Now, let's say I was gonna cut this board in half. You would take your featherboard and you wanna put, see how much these flex here? Just a little bit of pressure. You just want side pressure there into your fence, and you wanna make sure it's in front of the blade. For the same reason we talked about before about pinching your blade, you don't want your featherboard to push your board into the blade, and then from there, you can just push through your cut with one hand and boom, kick it out at the end. So let's talk about our last tip. All right, the next is the most obvious one, which was gonna help protect you in the event of something, which is proper PPE. So you need safety glasses like these, or push sticks, featherboards. Tool aprons are a big one. In the kickback video, we proved that our tool apron protected we used a ballistic gel dummy from actually getting hurt. So it kept the wood from puncturing. Anybody who's been hit with a kickback knows that it can break the skin. Dust mask, you can use respirators, but the important thing is that you're protecting yourself. Table saw causes the most injuries of any tool in the shop. Like I said at the beginning, 60,000 life-changing injuries a year. We're not talking about little cuts and scrapes. We're talking amputations, serious lacerations, kickbacks, head injuries, all of those things. And so you just need to protect yourself. You need to make sure that you're doing the things that prepare for the worst but hope for the best. And that's how you're gonna stay safe on the table saw and avoid making these common mistakes. Guys, thanks for watching. If you wanna support the channel, head over to kmtools.com and shop some of the many, many great tools we have over there. If you wanna support the charity, that's in the About section. The Katz-Moses Woodworkers with Disabilities Fund is trying to give away $1 million in tools to people with disabilities this year. And guys, as always, stay safe in the shop. Thanks for watching.